here. How is it that you always call while I'm spending a penny? Never mind. I've got a load to purge on you, Agent XJ7, but it's fresh and frenetic, and it's all about the waste of life. Get ready for me to drop a bomb on you. Here it comes. His name, Reagan OConnor. 47. Reagan was a man with a vision, realizing that through men all great things come into the world. He would find his words truer than he ever believed, and despite becoming a font of the miraculous, it would only deliver tragedies on par with his newfound endowments. Date, the latter half of the 2020s. Through man, all things would come. Yes, that is a heady philosophy indeed, and many might argue it from a theological or materialist perspective. But nonetheless, it was the personal belief and motto of one Regan OConnor, a scientist haplessly passed through the education system and wedged into high-budget experimental physics projects via the process of pure fate. Reagan never tried to be a blockage in the stream of life, one of those burdenous boulders standing annoyingly mid-passage in order to gain attention or demand tariff from those eager to progress with their own existence. He drifted with the flow, ebbed with the tide, and floated along the current that was easiest for him. And he had floated into the strangest little tidal pool that life had possibly ever flooded with bizarre possibilities and grotesque powers far aligned to any natural pattern. Through Reagan came a seemingly endless stream of people. They marched out from under his gaze and into the terminal before him. More and more. A city's population, it appeared. And then it trickled down to a cessation, and an endless stream of stewards hefted unbelievable amounts of physical items from inside Reagan's form. Steel beams, tall, thin boxes, luggage, plants, livestock, etc. Reagan merely stood still and observed, because he could do little else anymore. Reagan had no voice. He had no corporeal body anymore. He had little else than a form, an outline in physical reality, and a point of view solely his own. Reagan had no more need for sustenance or physical maintenance. His body had been translated into another realm of existence no one, not even his colleagues in practical or theoretical physics, could comprehend. Because they couldn't replicate nor measure anything about what had happened, nor was happening to Regan OConnor once he transformed into a mere cipher, a portal between spaces in physical reality. As the last of the goods from Bangladesh unloaded through Reagan into Los Angeles Airport, LAX for the locals, he spent his time reflecting on the curiosity of his own passage from human being into human utility. It was during an experiment in spatial warping, carried out at an adjunct laboratory to CERN in Switzerland. The goal was to fold space like a proverbial cloth it was supposed to be, and allow a few atoms of radioactive lead to leap across a minute spread of material reality via a hyperspatial duct. Mr. O'Connor was to monitor the event from inside the test chamber and catch the lead particles in a magnetic field propagated by a series of electromagnetic loops. Instead, he witnessed a bizarre flash of prismatic light as the hole in space was ripped by the complex machinery about him. His body was instantaneously sucked into the divide within our realm, and the portal supposedly disintegrated as the room exploded from a backlash of energy being sucked into the man-made throughway. A rippling fire after the concussion of that explosive moment shredded the facility in under a few minutes. Everyone escaped quickly, their lives intact. And from the aftermath strode a life lost, but yet transmogrified into something else never seen nor expected. Regan OConnor was from henceforth an invisible man without relation to his former corporeal entity. He was a sentient whole in the universe, an ambulatory silhouette with the volume and appearance of his erstwhile body. Regan OConnor no longer had any details, nothing within or without him to define him. He was only a fluidly morphing doorway in the semblance of his former self. No eyes, no nose, no clothes, no skin, no nothing, except the edges of where all these things were, and still seemed to be, but in another dimension or state of permanence divorced from this earth. What was seen through OConnor was yesteryear. More precisely, where he was at that exact moment, 372.1 days earlier, except it was in the current day, current time. Once his scientific colleagues coped with what had transpired to create an infeasible anomaly out of Regan, they began to test and attempt to attain understanding, which sadly evaded them, and ultimately, Regan OConnor was revealed to the public to become a novelty, a fascination, a meme, and after being an amusement, Regan became a utility of miraculous proportion to mankind. His life was ultimately his own. Though he couldn't speak, he couldn't hear, and his silhouette was only able to communicate by learning a form of sign language. And shortly, an erudite and advantageous young man with big plans came forward to propose scheduling OConnor in concert with all the governments of the world to allow passage between places on Earth for people and goods. It was a delight to people everywhere. It was going to reduce fossil fuel usage and carbon footprints by as much as 90%. Regan OConnor would be used as a passageway for all those things ships and planes and automobiles were used for in the past. Sure, local transport was still necessary, but through clever travel of merely one human, erstwhile human, much of the world could move instantly and avoid the expense and deleterious exhaust of industrial conveyance. And so Mr. OConnor spent years of his life flying to various places and standing still for hours as man and material were ushered from one point on the earth to another through him. For people going through Regan's silhouette, it was indescribably incredible. For Regan, it was boring. But it was all he could do. His hands wouldn't hold anything. His body could impact nothing, could manipulate nothing, and his body could feed on nothing. He could only think and observe as the world worked through him. He even witnessed a couple have coitus through him at one point. The proceeds going to charity, naturally. In fact, through OConnor, all monies and tidings for his beneficial efforts went to charities of his choice. It appeared that everything on God's green earth was improving, due to Regan OConnor. Rescues were even staged via Regan, getting people out of dangerous situations in an instant. The late 2020s were indeed astounding. And then an otherworldly imperative was impressed onto the form of Regan OConnor. Regan was to be the gateway to the stars, whether he liked it or not. NASA and the U.S. government behind it, and large portions of the international space and governmental communities buttressing them, hatched a golden goose of a scheme for O'Connor's unique talent. They would send him to Mars alone, and through O'Connor, they would begin colonization of Mars. That tenderly laid plan was the golden egg many people had yearned for. Escape! Escape from the loathsome governments and taxation. Escape from the maniacal and murderous ways of humanity. Escape from religion. Escape from responsibility. Escape from everything except themselves. And Mars, myriad other planets behind that one, would be the hope and the cure for all humans wanting to avoid humanity. Aside from their own glorious and self-righteous beings, naturally. Oh, the idiotic folly of mankind. Right, XJ7? Anyway, O'Connor was bundled aboard a bare-bones craft after a couple years of careful planning and prepping, the Earth watching agape as the rocket rose and turned and slowly tumbled into orbit, then boosting into moon orbit, and after a few days, blasting off toward the Red Planet. Tedium and boredom meant nothing to anyone else except O'Connor. Occasionally, a worker from NASA would pop through him into the capsule and converse with him, check the systems, and duck back to Earth. Other than that, it was an eventless journey, until Reagan could see Mars approach, and then expand beneath him. And it kept coming, closer and closer. And then he realized there was no reverse thruster firing. His craft was descending directly into the god of war without a hint of regret for imminent self-immolation at the hands of gravity and geology. Boom! The craft smashed so forcefully into the surface that it shredded itself into a billion pieces of useless detritus that would settle into a crater created beneath the careless trajectory. And from that trash, that unceremonious landing, strode the indestructible silhouette of Regan OConnor. He stood, the first human, if you could call him such, on Mars. Ever! He just looked out into the expanse of daylight on that reddish marble in space. He had no other objective than that. What was he to do, he thought? NASA and the boys on Earth would have to make their move. Reagan was little else than another thing in this vast universe. He had no true purpose other than that given to him by others. Suddenly, a burst of humanity gushed from within him, from under his point of view, and Mr. O'Connor saw dozens of space-suited folks blasting into the distance. After hundreds of people emerged, hundreds of tons of items and building materials were pushed out onto the surface of Mars, and then another stream of thousands of people, followed by thousands of tons of further supplies. During this migration, a helpful NASA assistant stood by Reagan and told him what was happening and what was to happen. They had a few weeks, as planned a year before, to teleport a gigantic colony onto the surface of Mars. Everything was loaded into and sealed within a titanic airlock building in the California desert. When Reagan would notice an ebb in activity, NASA was replenishing the spacious hangar with goods and people to begin another wave of advancing humanity. And within those months, plenty of research and construction and traffic went on around and through Mr. O'Connor. And then it was over. Though much building was still going on and much organization was carried out, the amiable little NASA assistant informed Reagan that his body from the past was soon to begin moving upward into the heavens, and they wanted to seal him off for the months of his space flight, so the atmosphere of Mars wouldn't be ripped into the vacuum of eternity. To accomplish this, Reagan would once more be isolated within a coffin-type chamber, where he would recline in peace until his past form stood on Mars. At that moment, a timed lock would release him back onto the surface of the red planet. Promises were made that this would repeat again and again as they would return Regan to Earth and then use him to get people to other planets so mankind would leap across the frontier of space. Only Regan OConnor was able to breach for the ambitious throng of humanity wishing to take up residence across the galaxy. And thus Regan OConnor waited patiently. Via a glass porthole, he could see outside the coffin he was in as people labored and then soon hid within the humongous shelter they had prepared. The travelers had brought through endless amounts of plants and food and fresh soil and water and everything. They were no doubt growing, cultivating, and thriving on the surface of Mars. Humans were inside their structures, creating and manufacturing. Occasionally, Regan saw people emerge and go out on mining expeditions or other such missions, but their processions slowly trickled to a halt, and for quite a while he saw no activity. Until one day his chamber popped open. Regan OConnor advanced out across Mars to the colony. He rung the doorbell on the airlock. No response. He walked about the vast perimeter, looking in. Nothing. No movement. And there he stood, for decades, inquisitive of what had happened to the humanity inside the colony. No signs of contact coming from Earth. Nothing. His hands weren't able to open doors or go through things. He had to wait for something to happen. No one left him any communication devices or radios to hear from. And then something fortuitous happened years later. A meteorite fell into a far outcrop of the central colony's building structure, and through that hole, Regan OConnor could make his way into the facilities and examine what transpired. It didn't take long to find thousands and thousands of bodies piled together in rooms and odd corners. These corpses were meticulously placed, collected, and organized as if done on purpose by someone or some group of survivors that wanted to archive the parade of expired humanity on Mars. For weeks, O'Connor merely moved among the departed and stared into their dried-out, wrinkling faces that were recessing into their skulls. Through the wilted and deceased vegetation and livestock at final rest. And then he eventually could trace back through the trail of humanity to one particular individual, the last survivor. And next to his corpse on a desk, scrawled in broad-tipped marker, were the simple words, "If I can't be supreme ruler of Mars, no one will be." No tears could come to Regan OConnor, no wails of grief, or even feelings of pity or sorrow or burning anxiety and rage. He was a cold automaton of a person. He knew that he would be trapped on Mars, perhaps forever, only able to stare at what was left of humanity. You see, through Regan OConnor, all things could pass, and all things did pass. Unfortunately, there is no man that can halt the evil that lies within the heart of people. No man can guard against the pitfall of lofty aspirations and boundless self-centered hate that the human heart can engender. And so these heady and thoughtless people that came from Earth ignored their own true natures, believing everyone was exactly like them in motive and mission, to find out too late that what they strove to escape was within them. Because that is the unfortunate state of unbridled secularist existence. Humanity running from its past and trampling fresh venues, rather than first comprehending and managing what exists. Their scientifically plotted, well-laid, opportunistic plans hatched from a golden egg. A true turkey, hatched, lifting its head aloft to eagerly stare into eternity among the stars as sorrow, like rain, poured into its gaping mouth, to die in the distance, choking on boundless greed and stupidity. Like and subscribe before I die, and ring the little bell or you will surely go to hell.
Oh, we're telling spooky stories. This is not a spooky story. Oh, there's no way on the couch I can sit.
Depends how you look at it. It is kind of spooky.
I guess so.
Wait, that's it? That's the end of the story?